Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We'll just give it a few more minutes to allow a few more people to join in, and we'll kick off. There's a few more people joining. For any of your colleagues that couldn't make it, we will be recording the session and sending it out to everybody following the webinar. But one more minute. There's a couple more stragglers still coming in. Okay, I think we'll kick off. Thank you again, all for joining. Yeah, really appreciate your time and joining this call. I hope that you'll find some, really valuable insights, and I guess, as we kind of discuss about some of the reality and the challenges that we're facing, both with a lot of the challenges that we're facing this year all around, with a lot of the cost increases and the cost of living crisis, and the issues that we're having around the increase of fuel costs as well. So, but we'll kick off. So yeah, once again, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today, we're here to talk about something that we're seeing come up again and again in schools across Australia. And that's why traditional BYOD programs are starting to break. So I guess we're not here to say that anyone's done the wrong thing by introducing a BYOD program. In fact, BYOD has made a lot of sense, 5 to 10 years ago, but the reality is the environment has changed, and we know that more ever before, the intentional use of technology in classrooms is needed more than ever before. So today we're going to unpack 3 things. First, how we're thinking about technology in the classrooms is shifting from more tech to intentional tech. Second, what we're consistently seeing is no longer working in BYOD environments. And finally, how schools are starting to think differently about more sustainable, equitable device strategies, and ultimately how they're funding them. So to do that, I'm joined by John-Mark Edmonds from our digital skills team, who spends a lot of time in classrooms with teachers and students, and Joshua Keane, who works with schools on funding, lifecycle, and sustainable models. I'm going to start by asking both John-Mark and Josh a series of questions, which we often hear from schools. We will have about 10 to 15 minutes towards the end of the webinar to answer your questions. So please use the Q&A section within Teams to list those questions as you think of them during the webinar. You should see it at the around the middle of the top of your Teams window. So with that, let's jump straight into it. John-Mark, you spend a lot of time in classrooms. how have you seen the shift in thinking from technology-enabled classrooms to a more intentional use of technology?
Yeah, great question. And look, it's something that we see and hear a lot over the last decade, probably. So much technology has been increasing around educational technology, right? This is something that we talk about and we hear.
Mhm.
And the general idea or premise that we've seen is, hey, this might have some value, so let's find a way to get it into the classroom, regardless of what it is. Maybe it's a smart panel, maybe it's key technology for devices, and a handful of other things. And what that's done is it's just put all kinds of technology in the classroom, and we aren't really seeing an improvement for student outcomes.
Mhm.
And so, what we're seeing now in probably the last 2 or 3 years, that mindset of just a technology enabled classroom is starting to fade away a little bit. And we've transitioned to this intentional technology, right? Yes, this key piece might sound like a great idea, or it might have an incredibly useful outcome. But if we don't know how to enable it properly, if we don't know how to set our teachers up for success with it, it's probably better to not introduce it because it becomes a distraction. It becomes a detriment to the learning outcomes and to the ability to teach effectively. So this intentional technology piece means that there are wider strategies in place. There is maybe a executive level oversight or panel in discussion of what are we going to adopt and how are we going to do this. And we're seeing it here with these numbers around how that ties into BYOD programs as well. Right? Something that we've seen, especially in the last decade, was moving to BYOD because we knew that we wanted to enable students to have a device and have technology so that they can learn and they can support the learning outcomes that they need. But with the changing cost of technology, with the number and variety of device experiences that are out there now, we're seeing schools actively reviewing that decision to be in a BYOD environment and experience and say, hey, we probably need to figure out something different. And so they're looking at managed programs, they're looking at standardized one-to-one device rollout. So every student in certain age groups will have their own device and it's provided by the school at that point.
Thanks, Jam. I guess, yeah, with that, we are seeing, the importance of, we're seeing a lot of schools really kind of questioning technology in the classroom where it, has, started to become more of a barrier than enabler of learning. So where we've seen, this shift in a more of intentional use of technology, what has that shift had on student outcomes and teacher workload?
So when we start thinking about that, as we become more intentional about it, it allows our teachers, our administrative staff to focus more on their actual day to day and the outcomes they want to achieve rather than
Mhm.
becoming this shadow IT team and expanding into, hey, well, I've got various students in my classroom that are struggling to get this application or this website doesn't load.
Mhm.
So then we are starting to solve that. And so as we're intentional about it, we are seeing some of those detractors start to move away, even
Mhm.
though the technology that we've put in hasn't necessarily changed, but we have a clear plan for how to enable it.
So I guess the key point here is technology isn't the problem, unstructured technology is. And when there's no real clear strategy behind what's used in the classroom, the burden often shifts to teachers and the IT teams, and learning ultimately suffers. So that's the backdrop for why we're now seeing BYD start to break. So let's talk a little bit more about what's actually not working. So yeah, next we're going to tackle a pretty big statement, why BYD is breaking. And when we say BYD is breaking, we're not talking about one single issue. We're talking about the cracks that are starting to show because of affordability, equity, classroom consistency, and cyber risks. are starting to become more apparent. So let's unpack that. Joshua Keane, from an affordability perspective, what are families and schools struggling with right now?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. I think to begin with, with your standard BYOD programs, it can look really simple and affordable on the surface, but it is becoming harder and harder for both families and the schools to sustain. So for families, it's not just about buying a laptop. It's becoming more about buying the right device at the right standards, making sure it lasts, and then absorbing the cost again if it breaks, ages out, or needs replacing. So we're seeing that be particularly hard for families where there's multiple children at the same school or more than one kid that is actually attending school. We're also seeing that with the standard BYOD program, it would normally have GST that's inclusive of the purchase price as well. So students or families are actually missing out on significant savings with potential usage models and GST also. And then I guess from a school perspective, they're also feeling the heat too, right? It's not just the families. So if you look at it from a school perspective, even if the family does have the right device, it's also then additional workload for the school's IT team, or if the school is in a regional or remote area, it could potentially be school teachers that are filling in as IT resource as well.
How does BYD unintentionally create equity issues within schools?
Yeah, I think this is probably the most important part of the conversation, really. Equity is just so important, especially in education, right? And if we look at it on paper, again, it might seem as though you're giving the students or the families freedom of choice and options, but in reality, what it's creating is friction in the classroom as well, right? Because there will be their peers and other students in the classroom that are using different devices. So it really can have an effect from an equality perspective. And we're seeing that gap obviously grow as well, especially, having worked with a major peak education body recently. It was quite amazing to see the difference between one school that was only 30 kilometres away from another. And I'm sure this is a peak body that had 54 different schools. And just the vast difference from a socioeconomic perspective, it really created a lot of challenges.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. It's certainly something we're all trying to think about and trying to tackle in not just in school environments, but it's something we're trying to tackle in a lot of organizations. John-Mark, when schools are not on a single ecosystem, whether that be Apple, Microsoft, or Google, how does that impact student focus and teacher planning?
Yeah, so we're seeing, because it's BYOD, you've got personal preference ties in, right? So my family, we're a Mac family, so we're going to bring, and we think that's the best device for my child. So we're going to get them a Mac. And then somebody is, hey, it's maybe that affordability piece, so we're going to go the cheapest possible option, whatever that is. And so you end up with all of these different scenarios in the classroom. And then whether it is IT or, as Josh mentioned, that kind of shadow IT, you've got teachers then stepping in to support the IT function in the classroom, it really starts to fall apart, because if I have a student that's struggling during a lesson, I then have to identify, is it a technology issue? Is it a student understanding issue? There are so many more variables that we've introduced that we then have to keep track in terms of their student focus. And then also as a teacher focus, if I'm trying to do something and in this classroom I know what it is, but my device breaks and so I have to go get a replacement or a spare from IT. Depending on the year, depending on what the recycle rate is in the school, I might not get a replacement device that's the same as my last one. So while technically maybe all of the stuff is the same, it might look a little different. Maybe my keyboard's a little different. And these then slow down my ability to deliver lessons and to be able to teach to what I need to teach, because there are now sudden small distractions in my day-to-day that compound and are then negatively impacting my students.
So with that, can you give an example of a tool or a workflow that really helps create that consistency, John-Mark?
Yeah, so I think one of the best examples that I've seen used well to establish some consistency, especially around committing to a single ecosystem,
Mhm.
is something like Classroom Notebook in OneNote, which is a Microsoft tool set. That ability to, as a department, have a notebook that has consistent layout and structure for how do we want to build lessons, right? How do we want to use a teaching framework so that we always have the right questions and we've got some hands-on activity and then we've got some self-paced learning so that students can build the strengths that they need. And then I have an ease of use to then push assignments and resources straight to students. Right? I remember what it was like being a student in year 9 through 12, and I'd get an assignment on a physical piece of paper. And if I was lucky, it made it to my locker. If I was even luckier, it made it into my bag, but it was generally at the bottom of the bag. So when it came time for that assignment to be due, my default was often, oh, I don't think I ever got that paper, right? Because I lost it.
Mm.
Whereas with tools like Classroom Notebook, you can have that structured setup, push it out. I ensure that every student has all of the information they need for that exact assignment. They have a scoring rubric. I can have a page that already has all of the reference and resources that they need to learn and prepare for that assignment as well. And as a teacher, I can even set a close date on that. So it doesn't even have to be me. If I've been in a lesson and had students really well engaged and I've forgotten to grab every assignment, I can just flip that switch on a digital notebook. And so every student should have had it in by that point. So again, going back to that equality and equity of experience, I know that no student has inherently gotten an extra day or two because they were out sick that day. Everybody had the same due date.
Thanks for that example, John. I think, once again, there are so many more, across, both Apple and Google as well, that they have these tools. When you go all in on their ecosystems, they've got these incredible tools, whether it's Google Classrooms or Apple Classrooms as well, that creates this focus and allows teachers to have more control over the classroom and creating better, cross collaboration between students and better communication and better student engagement. So moving over to another really important factor as to, I guess some of the big risks with BYOD programs is cyber exposure. So John-Mark, cyber risks is a big concern for schools. Schools are some of the most vulnerable organizations in Australia to cyber attacks. How does a BYOD environment increase exposure compared to a managed one-to-one program?
Again, going back to the number of different endpoints that have to be managed and protected and monitored, right? With the BYOD program, parents still want full control for their child to use the laptop because they bought it when it's not at school. But then when it's at school, they also want it super secure. And they are, again, all of these different environments, different ecosystems. And so we then have to work with an IT team that is meant to be subject matter experts on every possible attack vector for our most vulnerable people in society, right? Our youth, our children. And most schools are seeing this as a reality. You can see there from the statistics, it's pretty high. But most IT teams are taking the approach now that a cyber risk is a when event now, not an if event. And so when we're looking at all of these different things, if we can narrow that down with a one-to-one program and control, I know exactly what they are. I then have to have subject matter experts on a narrower focus rather than trying to cover everything and stay on top of it all at all times.
So I guess, yeah, look, one of the big opportunities to reduce those number of ecosystems and those endpoints to ensure that those are minimized.
Yeah.
So moving over to, I guess, one of the, we briefly mentioned it, and Joshua spoke about on the affordability piece on the previous slide, but one of the biggest challenges we see in schools looking to move away from BYD is how they're going to fund it. So, Josh, one of the biggest objections schools raise is cost. Why does that perception often not match reality?
Yeah, I think it comes down to the upfront price is really visible for the school, but the hidden cost is still a cost, but it's always going to be hidden. So that perception to begin with that it's going to be easier and it's going to be more cost effective for the school is purely based on covering that cost and the parents covering that cost. Also, I think the other element that sits behind that is the thought of the unknown. If a school has been obviously, not set in their ways, but set doing a BYOD program for some time, it's very hard to manage that transition to change. So with that, obviously, there are hidden costs, and there are also, there's that psychological burden as well for the people working through that within the school, right? So I think that's another element that sits behind the full transparent costing. The other part to it as well is obviously the cost to families. Is it going to cost families more to move to a more secure, more sustainable model when they've been doing this for many years, or it's been part of the IT policy for many years?
Because I think it is a common assumption that when schools make about passing costs on to parents, the perception is, if we introduce a one-to-one BYD program, we've got to introduce those ICT levies or those increased school fees to pay for it. Whereas, as you kind of briefly mentioned before, with the BYD model, parents are already actually often paying more because they're paying Inc. GST prices. It's a lot of the finance options that sit behind a retail model, the interest is far higher or the costs are far higher, whereas a commercial school model, it's an ex-GST education pricing where you're often leveraging those higher residual values to lower those costs. And kind of probably brings me to that next question, Josh. Can you maybe just walk us through how schools are using lifecycle or leasing models to make one-to-one programs more sustainable?
Absolutely, definitely. Just on that point as well, we spoke yesterday when we were doing a bit of a run through, and it was brought up around life cycle and leasing as to what sort of objections there would normally be. And there's always going to be a lot of resistance due to past experience or what you've been through before, right? I think the important element is to look at really the flexibility and the different models that are now available and the people that you're working with to deliver those models. So we're being much more creative in the market, especially given the current economic position we're all in. And yeah, we're seeing a real shift away from that standard vanilla leasing type arrangement to device disposal, capital injection from the device disposal to stage rollouts to reducing the cost of the upcoming lease payments, to even having the lease contract start date delayed for 12 months, let's say. payments, even having them delayed for another 12 or 18 months. So there's much more flexibility around these different usage models now. I know from previous experience as well, having designed an education technology exchange model, it was really designed in a way of ensuring that deployments were going out in the last quarter of the year, so term 4, to ensure that students and teachers actually had their device prior to the school holiday period, and then delaying the collection until the end of term 1. So ensuring that there was that added flexibility for collection and deployment, really playing into the overall strategy of schools, right? So enabling schools in other ways. So yeah, there's real flexible models that are available, not just financing models as well. You can see here there's a asset buyback service that we've put up here as well. So yeah, there's
probably on that. How do asset buyback or device salvage programs change the upfront cost conversation? Because I think that's something we're seeing in schools that have leveraged that really well, and it's been a game changer. The schools that can kind of dial that in is another option.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a massive benefit to the school. They're getting all their devices, all old devices that are end of life collected, secure data erasure, responsibly recycled if they're not able to be given a secondary life, and those that are going into the secondary market, reporting back on those from a sustainability standpoint. Also with the capital injection, having that amount go towards more strategic IT investments also. So not necessarily going against as we've put down here, going against the new purchase of the devices. It can be, it can be leveraged for other needs as well.
One last question, Josh. I kind of mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, a lot of the challenges that we're facing right now with the supply challenges, the shortages of both RAM and storage, which is driving up costs significantly across a lot of OEMs, but also causing some pretty significant delays and supply challenges. So I guess with that, how are schools navigating a lot of that, Joshua?
Yeah, so we're seeing the schools that are really well organised, taking a bit of a punt and placing their orders now, right? So they're placing their orders now and coming to us for a more tailored technology lifecycle solution, right? So they'll be placing their order, locking in the price today, so avoiding any price increases, and then having their payments start next year, so at a preferable date next year, and that's okay. We can certainly do that as well. But we're finding a lot of schools are really either holding on to their existing kit and figuring out what's next, or waiting to see what's happening in the market. But majority of them that are well organized are getting ahead of the game now.
Thanks, Josh. Okay, so we've heard a bit about from both Josh and John-Mark, and some of those big questions that schools are asking. The concern around the increased cost to parents, or the added pressure on already stretched IT teams, or often the perception that introducing a one-to-one school device program and a school all of a sudden having 500 to 1,000 devices in their fleet that the IT team are having to manage. Once again, that's the perception, but it's actually not the reality anymore. And that's part of the reason why BYD had its time, and why it used to exist. For a lot of reasons why scaling mass device management, a lot of the modern management methodology we have through Intune and Autopilot, or through Jamf, it's really, really easy to manage and to push out policies and applications at scale. And I guess that other big burning question is a lot of schools, and a lot of the reason why a lot of you are on the call, or that, slide earlier around, 70% of Australian schools either have or are thinking of moving away from BYOD. But it's that change burden, the time that it's going to take. But once again, this is something schools have been doing over and over and over, and making the shift. And there is a way to do it in a really simple and simple way. So I guess that kind of leads on to what we're all inviting you to do. So yeah, we've talked, I guess if what we've talked about has resonated with you, the first step is really simple. We'd like to invite schools to take part in a no obligation strategy workshop with our education and finance specialists. This is where we will sit down with you to unpack your current BYOD environment, understand your learning goals, your community context, and the challenges you're seeing around equity, cost, IT workload, and that classroom consistency piece that John-Mark touched on. So within this workshop, you'll walk away with a clear, data-driven view with a sustainable one-to-one strategy and what that could look like for your school. This is with real numbers, real options, and no commitment to proceed further. What's really cool when we run these workshops is we actually look at your current state of play versus what a future state could look like, and we do a bit of a cost analysis and what that can look like through these different models to give you something to take to the board. I guess if you would like to go deeper, we also have another option where we can support a deeper evaluation, including sending out some evaluation devices. We do a 3-day assessment of your environment. We look at all the different funding models and all the change planning. You'll get time, with your learning leaders to look at what, with one of our digital skills coaches, to look at what this would look like once we've set it up in your environment. What does it actually practically look like in the classroom? Some of those examples John-Mark was talking about is, what happens when you go all in on the ecosystem and some of the tools that you can all of a sudden utilize in the classroom, or a teacher can step into the classroom and technology just works, and there's better student engagement, there's better cross-student collaboration and more focus set around those. So we can kind of showcase with some of your learning leaders in that session. So these evaluations are fully funded. They value up to, depending on the vendor you want to go with, they're around $10,000 for that second step, but they're fully funded. We hope that they'll give you some confidence, but no pressure at the same time. I guess it just, will help you validate the approach with your leadership team, IT team, and the wider community within your schools. So we still have 10 minutes left. So we're going to move over to a bit of Q&A. So once I mentioned earlier in the call, within Teams issues, that Q&A section, I'll just pop over there now to see if I've got any questions already. Sure, comments. Okay, so we have one from a suit. So if a school moves away from BYOD to a managed one-to-one model, how do you handle the extra workload for IT around setup, management, updates, and repairs? There's 3 parts to this question. So I might just throw this first question over to you, John-Mark.
Yeah, so look, we have a full managed services team. So again, depending on how big your IT team is, depending on what the scale of that is, we have the option, and the vendor as well, right? What device you choose to. So for example, I know for Microsoft Surface, we're an authorized repairer. So we could come out and do some of those repairs depending on what they are. Things like setup and management, we have some team in-house that do some of that device build and the image work, or we work with other partners to facilitate that. So there's a lot of options. Again, the thing that I think is great about moving to these one-to-one models is we have, as Josh mentioned, a lot of flexibility to build out the right solution. Right? We, as a provider, ASI is an end-to-end solution provider. So however much or little you need or want to take advantage of with us as your technology partner, we can look to facilitate that.
And I guess that's the opportunity in that, that second step of running that proof of concept. We'll actually look at a lot of your environment to, ensure that we're providing all the recommendations and the expertise we have to be able to support, those efficiencies that you can find. Because once again, the perception is it'll be a lot of work. Once you've set it up properly, it's actually the opposite. A lot of these, whether it's Intune or Jamf, there's some amazing tools that make it really, really easy to manage large scale devices. Another question here. How have other schools handled parent concerns about paying for the device that is managed by the school but not actually owned by the school? Josh, I'm going to hand that one over to you.
Yeah, just to touch on that last question as well. It's a really common question that we get asked.
Yeah.
I'll use the example again, reverting back to a peak education body, because if you look at it on scale, it's almost like an international customer, right? Multiple different schools, different ways of working, and obviously standardizing their device selection, moving from one-to-one was a huge change. But it also comes down to that partnership and collaboration. Like, part of this journey is for us to understand exactly, like Jack mentioned before, is your current state, the data that's involved there as well. We'll look at the break fix, the non-returns, what sort of costs there are at the moment that are associated with all of the different points that you've highlighted in your question, and then building that into the solution so it's a more predictable flatline cost moving forward. And then from a project management standpoint, just making sure that all ducks are in a row as well, which is really important. With the cost, so so look, it's all about, again, it's sitting down and understanding exactly what the cost is at the moment to parents and what the cost will be moving forward. So with leasing models, for example, because there is a future market investment that's made from a finance company, typically the effective rate, so the effective interest rate, will be in the negative, right? Because if the equipment is worth, say, 25% in 3 years' time, then that is the investment that financiers would normally make upfront, which reduces that overall effective rate. So it actually makes it more cost effective for both schools and for families. So again, that's just an example as to what it will look like, but it's sitting down and understanding exactly what is the current state and what potentially it will look like on a funding model.
And I think probably what you're also trying to get to there in that question about, parents paying for a device that's actually managed by the school and that ownership. One way to think about it is just like, when you enroll to a certain school, like a lot of schools already have one-to-one institutions, one-to-one device programs in place. There is lots of things within the school that are being paid for within your school fees. And this is just another thing that, once again, it's, you enroll your student in this school, this is the technology program and services that you apply to that. And it's not just a device you're getting, it's a whole suite of services and support that protect the students and create a much better learning environment. When we spoke about a lot of those things you unlocked when you go all in on the ecosystem. As for students that already have a perfectly usable device and how schools usually manage that transition, it is a challenging one. There are lots of different options, whether it's, we talk about that asset buyback piece. So there is an option to have that, device resold, but there is just that tricky transition you need to kind of go through. And so there will often, be that challenging conversation you have to have. We do offer as a part of what we offer, to go out and do a parent information night where we sit down and talk to parents about why we're doing it. These are all the benefits. These are the challenges. These are the risks that we have. So we have to do it at some stage. You need to make the shift, but we're here to kind of support and manage those questions.
And I think, Jack, on that note, right, I think this is something that I love to call out, right? This is why we're seeing that move to intentional technology in the classroom, right? There is a strategy, there is a plan. It's not, hey, we just need to get another round of computers for kids, and we have to then try and come up with an explanation for parents on a parent night. That's something that we've partnered with before, and we've helped deliver those, that, hey, the school is transitioning to this. We'll come out as, again, myself specifically as a digital skills trainer to say, hey, parents, this is why the school has made the decision on this device, right? And I think to a couple of the other comments in chat, David and Anthony, yours in there. One, when it comes to device choice, what we see primarily is device choice for staff, one or two, like 2 or 3 options to choose between. For students, it's usually one, right? We don't necessarily want different student experience around, ensuring, again, going back to that equity piece, every student has the same device, there's no variation. Whereas for staff and teachers, maybe they get a different choice depending on what they teach and how they teach. And to Anthony's point around what that life cycle looks like, we're mostly seeing that 3-year cycle right now. So primarily the 7 to 10 and then 10 to 12 as the piece. So 7, 8, 9, they get a new device at year 7. That lasts them 3 years. Go to something like a buyback scheme, or they have the option to buy it outright. And then they get a new one in year 10 that goes 10, 11, 12. But yeah.
James, I might give this question to you as well. Thank you for the question, David Beattie. But can you comment on whether a choice of device should be offered when going to managed devices, or should there be one standard?
Yeah, so I think for students, like I mentioned, I think one option is best. I think do the work and do in a proper evaluation, consider different ecosystems, consider different form factors, right? There's some great stuff around there around 2-in-1s, tablet style devices, touchscreen or not touchscreen, pen or no pen. So you want to do a comprehensive analysis and make that decision. For students, I think it's one of the advantages, again, of moving to that one-to-one and managed program is you make it as easy and as consistent for your IT team as possible. If every student has one device, hot swaps, repairs, replace, troubleshooting becomes so much easier because a kid comes in with a broken one, I put it in the bay to repair it, and I just hand them a replacement. There's no question as to which config is it. Is it a different device? We're out of that device, so we've got to order more, so then a student has a different one temporarily. When it comes to staff devices, that's where we see a little bit more choice and flexibility. So for example, if people in math, sciences, language departments, they often prefer a tablet or 2-in-1 style device so they can be a bit more mobile. They want to use a digital pen or digital stylus so that they can do things up. If anybody's ever tried to type like a scientific formula on a keyboard, it's a nightmare. So being able to do that by hand is great. Whereas your history, they want a keyboard. They aren't necessarily interested, although I'm seeing more and more history departments that want to draw maps and mark things on a map digitally. So I think giving your staff a choice, but again, letting them know that this isn't a choice and you have infinite swaps over the next however many years. They're in the same boat, that give them time to evaluate, make a decision, but you're not going to be able to change your form factor for 3 years or 4 years, whatever that asset cycle is for the staff.
We are at time. However, there are a few other questions. So you're welcome to, we're happy to stick around for a few more minutes and answer these questions. We will follow up with some of these questions as well with you directly and share those answers. But I guess, JM, just to kind of touch on the previous question from Anthony, in year 10, 11, and 12, we have specialist subjects for design and tech, graphic design, etc. Should these students require high-spec devices, or should the school consider specialized computer labs? It's a really interesting question, right? Because there's a massive shift with NPUs and devices, and that kind of shifted the power we need on device, and labs, has very much shifted. So we're in a really exciting phase, or the opportunity that we have now compared to what we used to.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to give a definitive answer one way or the other on that. I think it's definitely something that we would work case by case to identify. I think, again, it goes back to what is your technology strategy as a school and as a program. Obviously, doing a computer lab, you might have a higher initial investment and setup cost in that. And that's probably looking to sustain and stay and be a bit more static. So it's something that happy for you to reach out to us and to the wider team at ASI, and we'd love to dig deeper and get more context on that question and give a more tailored answer.
Certainly what we're seeing is computer labs are less and less common. Most schools are pulling them out and, choosing the right technology that will suit the needs of those students. What we are seeing is those spaces just having a monitor that you can dock in, and those spaces are, more multi-use, and anyone can come in and use that space. What happens if students leave the school and they must return the device? So once again, this is probably, there's lots of different options, and policies, and they make sure that schools and parents are signing whatever they're signing as a part of the device program at the school. But what we do encourage you to do, we've got numerous of schools that we've worked with on this transition already. So if you'd like, reach out. We can, introduce you to some of the schools that have already made this transition and how they're making this work, and they've dialed, they have dialed it in. So on that, thank you all so much for joining the call today. We will be sending you an email shortly with a copy of the recording and a bunch of resources. And once again, this is something we're really passionate about. We would love to sit down and come visit your schools and have these discussions. So thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday, and hopefully we'll all speak soon. Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.